Hello and welcome back to the Argyle HR Leadership Forum, Workforce Wellbeing, Retention, and Engagement. My name is Michael with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. And to ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dana Washington, Managing Consultant with DDI. We're excited to have Dana for his thought leadership presentation titled Building a Culture of Trust. Dana, thank you so much for being here today and welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and great to be with everyone, and appreciate the time to spend with all of you, really related to a great topic around trust. And so, to Michael's point, managing consultant with DDI, I'm based here in our headquarters office in Pittsburgh and have been with DDI for a little over 25 years full-time. And in those 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with leaders across many organizations, every industry that you can imagine and think about, and a lot of great opportunity to talk about the topic of trust. And so when I got the invite to lead this session, it made me think about a session that I did very early in my career related to trust. And it really shifted my thinking on the definition of trust. So I remember working with a team of leaders, and we did a quick exercise, and every leader went around the room and shared to what extent they trusted each other within that room. And the first leader that went through that exercise said, absolutely not do I trust my peers and my colleagues. And as we did the round robin of that exercise, the next step was to then understand the response from each one. And what we learned from that leader was the term trust really resonated with him in such a way that he looked at trust from a personal perspective. He talked about trusting close friends and family, but when he thought about trust related to the workplace, it was very different. And so it wasn't to say his definition of trust was good or bad or right or wrong, but ultimately it taught me something in that we all have our own working definition of trust. And we also have our perception of what it means to build trust, what it means to break trust. So I'll think about some of those examples as we go and think about then, what are some things that we do to build trust, to engage people? And what are some things we may unintentionally do to break trust? We also know that related to this topic, there's a lot of personality attributes that come in. Some people naturally trust others until they have a reason not to. And others are very skeptical. They may not trust people until they build that trust. So my challenge to all of you is to think about, how do you define trust for yourself? What does it look like when you're building trust within your workplace? And then also, what are some of the expectations that you have related to some of those key trust factors? So I appreciate everyone. You've all started to respond to the poll, and this gives me a chance to hear from all of you, at least indirectly here through the poll, to learn a little bit more about some of the challenges that you're facing within your relative organizations, and see a nice variety here in terms of shortage of skilled workers, and also change fatigue, which is a common one, and turnover is another one that seems to be rising to the top of this list. And my guess is if I was sitting in the same room, same time with all of you, you could identify a host of other organizational challenges that you're facing. So I appreciate your response to the poll to give me a sense for what you're seeing. I also see some good responses, or a number of responses around the quiet quitting and disengagement. So the reality is, everyone, what's behind a lot of these challenges is concerns about trust. Lack of trust within different organizations and within different cultures. And so we know that trust is a reality in how it plays out and how it helps people either be engaged in their roles and in their organizations, or perhaps disengage. So other things that we've seen in terms of workplace challenges, we talked about quiet quitters, lots of change, failed return to work initiatives. So if we look at the reality where we are today, even though we're in a different phase of the pandemic, we're still feeling the impact of the pandemic. And a lot of workplace challenges are related to the dramatic shift and change that required us to make. And also now that we're settling into a new reality, not getting back to the way things were, some of those challenges continue to carry on. And so managing some of those remote teams, a lot of organizations have hybrid teams, and there's change or there's challenge that comes with that from a trust perspective. At the heart of all this, though, we know lack of trust creates its own set of challenges. And many times when we're aware of the impact of lack of trust, it gives us a chance to do something with it and about it. Sometimes we don't necessarily know that. So I think we can all level set and agree on the fact that trust is a critical component, and we know that it's very important. Now, we also see this out there in the marketplace from a research perspective in the news. So it makes me think about an Edelman trust barometer that they do yearly, and they've actually done this for well over 20 years. Many of you are probably familiar with the trust barometer. And then the most recent version of this study that they've done, that more than 36,000 respondents responded to this study, and 77% of those individuals really identified the fact that they place huge amounts of trust in their employers, meaning that they trust that their employers are giving them the information that they need and setting them up for success. But what we also know is that there's a high expectation around what leaders are doing and high expectations around how those leaders engage. So for example, amongst the respondents, 81% of those respondents to the survey or to the study really have an expectation that CEOs are visible when it comes to speaking to things related to their public policy or what their organizations have done to benefit society. That's a reality. So the mindset of CEOs being individuals that you don't see except maybe on websites or in big events, people have more of an expectation for those CEOs to be visible. And then also 60% of those respondents identified that the reality for them when they're considering a job within an organization, they really have an expectation that CEOs speak to different things that really relate to them in terms of social challenges and issues, political challenges and issues. So the baseline is that we know that lots of trust in employers, and the expectations are high in terms of what leaders do to engage and to demonstrate that level of trust. So interestingly enough, when we think about the value of trust, let's go to the next phase and think about what are some organizations doing and that might actually damage trust. So it makes me think of a recent Wall Street Journal article that really started to speak to the realities of a number of organizations implementing monitoring technology. Let's pause and think about that in relation to the context of trust. So in the new environment where many individuals work remotely or they're part of a hybrid work environment, the mindset of that an organization is monitoring their keystrokes, or organizations are looking at what they're doing and how they're doing it to gauge to what extent they are actually doing their work. It doesn't send a strong message of trusting that individuals are doing what they should be doing, or that individuals are productive even though they can't be seen. So in the word cloud that I shared in the previous slide, or one of the previous slides, you may have seen quickly the proximity bias. And you may have heard about this around many leaders have a perception that in order to build rapport and maintain strong connections with individuals, they need to be seen. They need to be in the same office at the same time. And in this new environment where they can't necessarily see individuals and they're bringing technology in to monitor to what extent people are productive, it's a counter message. Yes, we trust our employees. Yes, we feel like a hybrid environment or remote environment is a viable way for people to work. However, implementing monitoring technology doesn't necessarily align with a we trust our employees message. The other interesting reality from this article, everyone, is that some organizations don't necessarily let their employees know that there's monitoring technology. So even though from a research perspective, from a marketplace perspective, we know trust is absolutely critical to building culture, to driving engagement, there are a lot of practices out there that go against setting the stage for trust within different environments. Now, as we continue on, everyone, well, I will also refer to DDI's Global Leadership Forecast. And so this is a study that we do every other year. And for our latest one, what we started to look at is quality ratings for leaders. And so what this graph quickly shows you is that as we look at some of the percentage of leaders who rated their organization's leadership quality as either very good or excellent, you see quite a bit of a decrease or a dip from 2020 study to the 2022 study. The first thing I thought about was early pandemic. If you look at some of the messaging from leaders, appropriately so, it was leaders really working to better understand the whole employee. What were some things they were struggling with in terms of their role? What were some things that they were struggling with in terms of balancing their role and a lot of unforeseen circumstances in their personal lives? So a lot of leaders really dialed up their empathy. They focused on the whole person and the whole employee. One thing that I've done from an executive coaching perspective is, as we've evolved from the start of the pandemic, a common coaching question I asked leaders early on in an introduction is, what did you learn about your leadership style early pandemic? How did you change things? What did you do to engage your employees differently? And a common reaction was the interpersonal connectivity, understanding the need of true empathy, the need to engage and connect with their employees, which made perfect sense. As I've continued asking that question over time, some leaders struggle to answer it because they're now feeling like we're in a new reality now. We don't have to worry about those things nearly as much. Not true. We've set the expectation that leaders focus on the whole person, the whole employee. So it's something to think about around this dramatic shift or dip in the percentage of individuals who really rate their leaders' quality as good or excellent. And we know that a key component of that is trust. And so a call to action for many leaders and individuals across the board is, remember some of those key learnings when you had to engage people in a different way. You had to demonstrate a level of interpersonal sensitivity that you just didn't really dial into prior to the start of the pandemic. There's an expectation that that continues on. There's an expectation that leaders do that on a consistent basis, and they do that in a genuine, authentic way. So it's great. It's interesting data point here to think about when within different organizations, what contributed to this dip. When I look at this study and the number of leaders that that have participated in this, you have several thousand leaders who participated in this experience. And so it's a great data point to really think about the call to action around engaging and building that environment of trust and the impact of not doing so. Now, the other thing that we know from HBR is that there is this reciprocal reality from a trust perspective. So what we gathered from HBR is that for those leaders who create a trusting environment and who trust their employees and their associates, but also trust that those employees and associates are putting their best foot forward, and they're also giving them room and empowering them, there's some great value in doing so. So a couple of statistics related to that. Productivity is higher amongst those teams that really rate their leaders as having high levels of trust and giving them room to do their work and do it well. We see improvement in terms of level of energy and decreased amounts of stress, less burnout. And so if you look at the value of those leaders really creating that environment of trust, empowering their associates, supporting them along the way, there's some tremendous benefit. That benefits the leader, that benefits the individual employees and associates, and that benefits every organization that can speak to and has some of these realities in terms of their culture of trust. All of these are equally important. I latch on to everyone this statistic around 40% less burnout. So what we've gathered from a research perspective is that individuals who experience burnout in an organization are 2 times more likely, or 2.5 more times likely, to leave that organization because of burnout. We've heard about burnout for many years, and it's taken on a different reality here in recent years. And so if we look at that purely from an employee experience, if we have leaders who are creating a trusting environment, who are supporting those individuals, and they're aware of signs of burnout, they're getting in front of those situations to help people manage that, that's increasing their engagement. And that is really benefiting, again, everyone within those particular environments. So one of many research examples and realities that trust matters. Trust has tremendous impact, and it has impact across all levels of an employee population. This is a slide, everyone, that I'm going to spend a bit of time on for a host of reasons. Quite honestly, for one reason, I have a bit of passion related to this because we're down to the behavioral level. So again, back to our global leadership forecast, the most recent version of the study that we've just completed here. And we'll be putting out those results here in the month of February. We really looked at some of those behaviors that boost trust. And so what we looked at is for those respondents in the global leadership forecast who rated that they trust their leader, 85% of those respondents identified these behaviors as core behaviors that those leaders demonstrate that contribute to trust. The tried and true is empathy. And we'll talk a little bit more about empathy here further into our session here today, but it's great to see empathy, and I'm not surprised. Empathy's been with us for as long as I can recall, definitely longer than I've been within my roles within DDI, but it's something that many leaders continue to struggle with. They either overthink it or they feel like if they just simply let people know that they understand, then that's empathy. Not necessarily the case, but we know that empathy and demonstrating that in a consistent, genuine way boosts trust. If you look at some of these others around those opportunities for growth and development, think about your own personal journey in your career where you have leaders who've supported your development. They believed in you and given you opportunities. If you failed, if you missed the mark, it wasn't punitive, but it was a learning experience. That's a great trust builder for leaders who do that on a consistent basis, provide that support and help people grow and develop and help them flourish in their careers. The sharing thoughts and rationale for decisions, and also genuinely acknowledging own failures. This is the human side of leaders, everyone. Those leaders who are able to bring that human side forward. So they have points of view, they have perspectives. So sharing a little bit more of the backdrop to certain decisions, being willing to be transparent, but also a level of vulnerability related to acknowledging their own failures. Those are really those behaviors that bring not only the leader's human side, but it demonstrates that level of vulnerability. And what we also gathered from the leadership forecast is that the more leaders demonstrated a willingness to be vulnerable in the way that, again, was true to them, that also contributed to creating and sustaining an environment of trust. So to round out some of the other behaviors, if you look at inquiring and caring about employees' well-being, I touched on this a little earlier. Early pandemic, or as leaders really realize the need to change their interpersonal approach to their leadership style, caring about the well-being of all of their associates. So important. It's not just about their work lives, but their entire well-being, and doing so in a way that shows that they support them. You look at encouraging others to challenge old ways of doing things. So challenging the status quo, building an environment where people should bring new ideas to the table and they get the support to be able to implement some of those ideas. And if maybe they try on new things that don't necessarily land the way they anticipated, that it is a growth experience and their leaders support them along that journey. And then last but certainly not least, that recognition of success for teams. So many times within most organizations and environments, moving from one priority to the next. And we're so focused on the next milestone. And once we accomplish that, not pausing and reflecting, but moving on to the next. So for those leaders who can recognize the success of their team members, whether it's the team as a whole or individual team members, that has been tremendously valuable in terms of building that environment of trust. From my own experience, I think about leaders who many times these aren't new behaviors for them. If I were to share this slide with a leader I was coaching or share it in a group that I was facilitating to, not necessarily new behaviors that they haven't thought about before, but it's the reminder around the value of demonstrating these behaviors on a consistent basis. Doing so in a way that brings the heart forward, that shows that they care, that shows that there's a human side, And so it's great to see these bubble back up in terms of research, but also what's the practical application? How do we see people doing and demonstrating these on a consistent basis? So some great behaviors to look at and to think about for your own selves, but also how you define trust and what you expect from leaders in terms of demonstrating that trust. So I want to take a little quick sidebar here and revisit the whole topic of empathy. And as I mentioned, the tried and true empathy. It's always great to see this land on any slide that I'm speaking to for any reason, to be honest with you all. But from an empathy standpoint, as I mentioned, two things. One is many times it's over-engineered. So leaders and individuals who are trying to be more empathetic, they might overthink it, might be verbose and feel like they have to share with someone that they've walked a mile in their shoes. But the other is that sometimes people identify empathy or see empathy as just simply saying they understand, and that's not the case. So the reminder around the empathy formula, to keep it straight to the point, consistent, genuine and authentic, but straight to the point. So we're always looking at focusing on the fact and the feeling of a situation. It doesn't have to be more or less than that. And it's really looking at those situations where when you're engaging someone, first and foremost, think about those leaders who are present. They're present, they're actively listening. So they're locked into the needs of the individuals that are around them. But also by being present, they can truly identify that they've heard what they're feeling. And it doesn't have to be a challenging emotion. Maybe it's a positive emotion where they're ecstatic about something, or they are feeling great about a milestone that they just hit. Regardless of what the feeling is acknowledging that and a quick recap of the situation at hand. That's the empathy formula. And I've worked with a number of leaders who, once they got the repetition down and really eliminated the noise so they could be focused and present when they're interacting with people, they've really been able to bring empathy forward in a way that's consistent, genuine, and authentic. So it's great to be able to revisit this and challenge everyone to think about the simplicity of empathy and ways to do this on a consistent basis. Now, if we talked about what builds trust, let's also talk about some trust breakers. And I won't go into each of these in specific detail, but we know that unfortunately there are things that are sometimes done to break trust. Things like perhaps inconsistent behaviors or breaking promises or making assumptions. I have yet to work with an individual or a leader who's intentionally broken trust. Many times the challenge is to think about intentions versus impact. Individuals come to the roles most of the time, if not all the time, with the best of intentions, but the impact of what they do and how they do it doesn't necessarily land. So we know that there are some of these behaviors that break trust, but also let's not overlook some of the why behind that. There are triggers, and when we think about high levels of stress, that can trigger people and it can trigger behaviors that they don't intend. And so some of those triggers can break trust, right? It might be sensitivity to criticism. It might be just someone has a substantial amount of stress that they're trying to manage, and they're not showing up in the way that they intend to. And so sometimes in that moment, they don't necessarily realize that they are being dismissive, or they're not engaging people in a way that's focused on the whole person. And so that stress response can be really the driver behind breaking trust. And many of you have heard the expression that it can take a lifetime to build trust, but you can break trust in the blink of an eye. And so a call to action for all of us is to be mindful of how does our stress play out around how we engage people? How does that impact the extent to which we engage or disengage, and how we may inadvertently break trust? And there's oftentimes, if we go back to some of those trust builders, acknowledging failure. I've worked with many leaders who they own it and genuinely apologize and take ownership and recognize the impact of things that they may have done to break trust. So as we get toward the close of our session here, I just want to revisit the reality of trust in terms of different levels of leadership. So from a research perspective, what we gathered here in our most recent round of the Global Leadership Forecast is that we know that trust matters at the top, From the respondents, what we gathered is that 32% of those respondents really felt as though they trusted their senior leaders to do what's right. And then 46% trusted their manager. So there's some work to be done at the top. And when we look at that work at the top, it's, well, so Dana and DDI, what do you mean by leaders? So what do senior leaders need to be thinking about in relation to building trust? Well, interestingly enough, but not a surprise, many of the behaviors that we talk about across leaders really apply to senior leaders as well. But the thing about this is the visibility of their roles, and also they need to be able to bring the vision forward and have individuals trust the direction of an organization. But when we look at senior leadership, building trust, similar behaviors, but it's just amplified. There's a lot more spotlight. There's a lot more implication of breaking trust and more challenging to rebuild that trust. So the calls to action for leaders runs the gamut across all levels of leadership to build and sustain trust and be mindful of what can happen to break that trust and be able to address cycles of mistrust. So at the end of the day, everyone, we know trust is good for business. It's good for engagement. It's good for the health and well-being of individuals within any organization. So the more we're building trust, the more we're able to engage others, and the more we're able to continue to have an environment and a culture that is anchored in and built in trust. So in the last couple of minutes that we have here, everyone, what I'll do is, I know there's been a few questions that have been coming in, so I'll take a look at a few of these questions and answer as many as I can before we close the session. But I see one question is, what is one simple change we can make today to gain more trust? I would say transparency and communication. That's a simple change. That's something that we can all implement, and we can do that today to gain more trust. Another one that I've seen that individuals can bring to the table immediately is taking ownership for challenges that are faced. If there are missteps, if perhaps a mistake was made, is not overlooking that and not deflecting, but taking ownership of that. And so those are simple things that can be done, and done in a genuine and authentic way, that can actually go a long way. Another question that came in is, what are some ways leaders can model the way that would lead to more trust? And the follow-on to that, which I really love, is that being vulnerable and transparent. Yes, absolutely. Let me add to the piece around the vulnerability and transparency. The challenge is for leaders to do so in a way that's authentic to themselves. If you have a roundtable discussion with people and you ask them about reaction to vulnerability or sharing things that they consider vulnerable, this is another thing that people sometimes overthink, or they feel like there's a certain way that they're supposed to engage here. And in those situations, my challenge has always been for them to do so in a way that's authentic to them, and do so in a way that's timely. And oftentimes what that does is it brings the person's true personality forward, but it shows that human side. So the short answer to that question is leaders being vulnerable and transparent, absolutely. But also being mindful of the cycles of trust. How can they be consistent in their behaviors and not have it be episodic? Or sometimes they take ownership and sometimes they don't. So the other challenge would be to maintain that level of consistency in terms of how they demonstrate some of those core behaviors. Certainly time for at least one more question. So one question here is, how can we balance transparency with security? I think that's very situational when you think about the balance between the two. There's a lot of different layers that we could take related to that. But when I think about the level of transparency, it's what information and insight is appropriate to share given the situation at hand. And being mindful of, one way to build trust is being mindful of what information should and should not be shared, and being able to draw that fine line. Oftentimes individuals will appreciate and respect, especially from a leadership perspective, that some information cannot be shared at different times, but being able to be transparent and open and willing to share when possible and when it's applicable. And again, doing so in a consistent way tends to really continue to create that cycle of trust in any environment, whether it's across an organization or within teams within an organization. So everyone, I really appreciate the opportunity to spend this time talking about trust. And really, I appreciate the questions in relation to the practical application. So Michael, I know we're just about at time here. I will hand it back to you. And again, really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Dana. This was a wonderful presentation. We appreciate you being here. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today for this fantastic thought leadership. Now, this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thank you, everyone. Dana, thank you.